In today's chilling story, we uncover the shocking events that led a mother to take justice into her own hands. Stay tuned as we explore the case of a pastor shot at the altar by the very woman he betrayed. Pastor Leonard Grace was a man deeply admired in his small southern town. His sermons were fiery and captivating, drawing people to the pews every Sunday without fail. Known for his outreach efforts, Leonard was often seen helping families in need, counseling troubled youth, and organizing charity events that benefited the entire community. To outsiders, he seemed the epitome of a righteous man, but Leonard harbored a secret, one that threatened to unravel his pristine image if ever revealed. Several years earlier, Leonard had become involved in an affair with a young woman named Ruby Wells. Ruby was a vibrant and hopeful member of his congregation, drawn to the same charm that captivated so many others. Their relationship was brief but intense, conducted in whispers and hidden moments away from prying eyes. When it ended, Ruby discovered she was pregnant with Leonard's child. Unlike Leonard, Ruby had no wealth, power, or position to shield her from the realities of life. Her pregnancy forced her to leave her job as a waitress, and the stigma of being an unwed mother in their conservative community was almost unbearable. She bore the burden of raising her daughter, Chloe, without any support from Leonard. Although Ruby initially hoped he might step forward and help, those hopes were dashed. Leonard made it clear that he had no intention of acknowledging their child. For years, Ruby suffered in silence, trying to provide for her daughter while avoiding the church Leonard preached in so passionately. She wanted to believe that she could manage on her own, but life was never easy. Between low-paying jobs and mounting bills, she often found herself wondering how different things could have been if Leonard had accepted his responsibilities. While he stood before a congregation, speaking of morality and community, Ruby struggled with the knowledge that he had abandoned his own flesh and blood. As time went on, Ruby's frustrations grew into bitterness. She saw Leonard's face on flyers for community events, his name printed in local papers alongside accolades for his work. To the public, he was a shining example of virtue, but Ruby knew the truth. Every smile he shared with his followers felt like a slap to her face. Every time she walked past the church and heard his voice echoing through the open doors, it reminded her of the rejection she had endured. Despite her anger, Ruby still tried to approach Leonard over the years. At first, her tone was soft, almost pleading. She would write him letters, drop by his office when the church was empty, and even leave messages asking for a private meeting. But Leonard was adamant about keeping his distance. His responses were cold and dismissive, with a thinly veiled warning for Ruby to stay quiet. He was concerned only with his reputation, afraid that the revelation of their affair would ruin the respect he had worked so hard to earn. As Chloe grew older, Ruby's financial struggles worsened. Medical bills, school supplies, and basic necessities all became heavier burdens. Chloe began asking questions about her father, and Ruby's carefully crafted stories to protect her daughter's feelings started to falter. Each day brought a new reminder of the man who had turned his back on them, and Ruby's patience was wearing thin. The anger she had suppressed for years began to simmer, quietly waiting for a breaking point. Ruby Wells had spent years keeping her bitterness hidden, burying it beneath her responsibilities as a single mother. Life as a waitress barely provided enough to cover rent and groceries, let alone the unexpected expenses that seemed to pile up endlessly. She worked long hours, her feet aching at the end of every shift, only to come home and face another round of unpaid bills and questions from her daughter, Chloe, about why life felt so unfair. For most of her daughter's life, Ruby had done her best to shield Chloe from the truth about her father. She painted vague but kind pictures of him, never revealing that the man she described was Pastor Leonard Grace, a figure revered by nearly everyone in their small town. Ruby's silence was born out of a desire to protect Chloe from the pain of rejection. But the weight of carrying the secret alone became unbearable over time. When Chloe's health took a sudden turn, Ruby's carefully managed life fell apart. What began as minor symptoms quickly escalated into a diagnosis that required expensive treatments. The financial strain pushed Ruby to her limits. Rent was already overdue, and her landlord had started leaving notices on her door. Every time the phone rang, it brought another reminder of how deep in debt she had fallen. Ruby felt like she was drowning, and Leonard's indifference to their plight only made it worse. Desperate and out of options, Ruby decided to confront Leonard again. She crafted letters, carefully laying out the details of their situation, pleading for him to finally step up and provide the support she and Chloe so desperately needed. She left voicemails on his office phone, her voice steady but tinged with urgency, explaining that this wasn't just about money. It was about giving their daughter a chance at a better life. But Leonard didn't respond. Each attempt was met with silence, as if her words evaporated the moment they reached him. Ruby's frustration began to boil over into anger. She couldn't understand how Leonard, a man who stood before a congregation every week preaching love and compassion, could turn his back on his own child. He lived comfortably, his every need met by the same people who praised him for his generosity. Meanwhile, Ruby scraped together change to pay for groceries, skipped meals so Chloe could eat, and stayed up late worrying about how she would afford the next round of medical bills. Her resentment deepened every time she saw Leonard. Whether it was his smiling face on a church bulletin or a fleeting glimpse of him in town, Ruby was reminded of his betrayal. She began to feel like the walls were closing in around her, the burden of raising Chloe entirely on her own becoming too much to bear. One Sunday morning, Ruby found herself parked outside the church in her beat-up sedan, staring at the imposing structure as parishioners filed inside. The sight of Leonard greeting his congregation, his face warm and inviting, ignited a fire in her. He was living a lie. His life built on a foundation of deceit, while she and Chloe suffered. Inside the glove compartment of her car was a revolver, a weapon she had inherited from her father years ago but never imagined using. As the church bells rang and Leonard's voice echoed faintly through the open doors, Ruby gripped the steering wheel tightly. The anger and desperation that had simmered for years finally bubbled over, pushing her toward a decision she could never take back. The church was packed that Sunday morning, with every pew filled by devoted members of the congregation. Pastor Leonard Grace stood at the front, his presence commanding as he began his sermon. His voice carried through the high ceilings, filled with the same passion and conviction that had drawn so many to his ministry over the years. The air inside was serene, a stark contrast to the storm brewing just outside the church doors. Ruby Wells sat in her car in the parking lot, her mind racing with the whirlwind of emotions. She had never set foot inside the church since Leonard had cast her aside, yet here she was, trembling with anger and desperation. Her thoughts were consumed by years of frustration and the pain of watching Chloe grow up without the support she deserved. Each moment spent in that car seemed to stretch endlessly as Ruby wrestled with the decision she had already made. Finally, Ruby stepped out of the car, slipping the revolver into her coat pocket. Her footsteps were steady but purposeful as she approached the church entrance. The murmur of Leonard's voice grew louder with each step, the words of his sermon piercing through her haze of emotion. She pushed open the heavy doors and entered the sanctuary, her presence unnoticed as she joined the standing congregation. Leonard stood behind the pulpit, his arms raised in a gesture of reverence. The congregation hung on his every word, their faces glowing with admiration and faith. Ruby moved down the aisle, her gaze fixed on him. He didn't notice her at first, his attention focused on delivering his message. But as she drew closer, something in his peripheral vision caught his eye. When Leonard saw Ruby, his expression faltered, if only for a moment. His voice wavered as their eyes met, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Ruby's pace quickened as she moved closer to the front, the crowd shifting uneasily as they noticed her presence. Whispers rippled through the pews as people began to sense that something wasn't right. Ruby stopped just a few feet away from the altar. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, and her fingers closed around the cold metal of the revolver. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Leonard's confident demeanor cracked as he stared at Ruby, his mouth slightly open as if searching for words. The congregation watched in stunned silence, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Without hesitation, Ruby pulled the gun from her pocket and raised it, her hands trembling but her resolve unshaken. The sound of the shot echoed like thunder through the sanctuary, shattering the stillness. Leonard staggered backward, clutching his chest as blood spread across his white shirt. The congregation erupted in screams, people scrambling to get away from the scene. Leonard collapsed to the ground, his body slumping against the altar he had stood behind for so many years. Ruby remained rooted to the spot, the revolver still in her hand. The chaos swirled around her, but she was deaf to it, her mind blank as she stared at Leonard's lifeless form. Within moments, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the church. The police arrived to find Ruby standing alone at the altar, the gun hanging loosely in her hand. She didn't resist as they cuffed her and led her away, the weight of what she had done settling heavily on her shoulders. The once holy sanctuary was now a scene of blood and heartbreak, the echoes of that single shot lingering long after the sound had faded. Ruby Wells was taken into custody without resistance, her face devoid of emotion as she was led out of the church in handcuffs. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the police escorted her to the patrol car, the once sacred space now marred by the violence they had just witnessed. Sirens wailed in the background as an ambulance arrived, though it was too late for Leonard Grace. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene, his body slumped against the altar where he had preached for so many years. News of the incident spread rapidly, leaving the small town in shock. Leonard had been a beloved figure, a man who seemed untouchable in his position of moral authority. To many, it was inconceivable that someone could harbor such animosity toward him, let alone take such drastic action. Speculation swirled as reporters descended on the church, capturing footage of the blood-stained altar and interviewing distraught members of the congregation. Ruby was taken to the local police station, where she was booked and placed in a holding cell. The weight of her actions began to settle on her as she sat alone, staring at the stark gray walls around her. She thought of Chloe, the daughter she had tried so desperately to protect and provide for, and the years of struggle that had led her to this moment. While Ruby felt a flicker of regret for the violence, a deeper sense of vindication simmered beneath the surface. For once, Leonard could no longer ignore the consequences of his choices. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the shooting, Ruby's motives became clear. The letters and voicemails she had sent to Leonard were uncovered, each one detailing her pleas for support and the mounting desperation she faced as Chloe's needs grew. Friends and neighbors who knew Ruby spoke of her tireless efforts to provide for her daughter, painting a picture of a woman who had reached her breaking point after years of neglect from the man who should have been there for them. However, the story was not so straightforward to everyone. Leonard's supporters were quick to come to his defense, portraying him as a victim of unwarranted aggression. They pointed to his reputation as a community leader, questioning why Ruby had waited so long to come forward with her accusations. To them, the idea of Leonard abandoning a child was unthinkable, a stark contrast to the man they knew and admired. The revelation that Leonard had fathered a child with Ruby sent shockwaves through the town. Many of his followers struggled to reconcile the man they had looked up to with the secret he had kept hidden for years. Some felt betrayed, their faith in Leonard's integrity shattered, while others clung to the belief that Ruby's claims were exaggerated or false. Meanwhile, Ruby's legal battle began. Her defense team argued that years of emotional and financial abandonment by Leonard had driven her to act out of desperation, They highlighted her attempts to seek help through legal and personal channels, all of which had been ignored or dismissed by Leonard. Prosecutors, on the other hand, painted Ruby as a cold-blooded killer who had planned the attack with malicious intent, pointing to the revolver she had brought to the church as evidence of premeditation. As the case garnered media attention, Ruby found herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Strangers weighed in on her actions, some calling her a hero for standing up to a hypocritical figure, while others condemned her as a murderer who had taken a life in a place meant for peace and worship. Ruby remained silent through it all, her thoughts consumed by the fate of her daughter, now left to navigate the world without either parent by her side. Ruby Wells's trial became a focal point for the community, drawing intense media attention and public scrutiny. The courtroom was filled daily with spectators eager to witness the proceedings, while news outlets provided continuous coverage, dissecting every detail of the case. The prosecution portrayed Ruby as a cold-blooded murderer who had premeditated the killing of Pastor Leonard Grace, emphasizing the sanctity of the church as a place of worship and peace. They argued that regardless of any personal grievances, taking a life was an unforgivable act that demanded justice. In contrast, the defense presented a narrative of a desperate mother pushed to her limits after years of neglect and abandonment by Leonard. They highlighted Ruby's numerous attempts to seek assistance through legal and personal avenues, all of which had been met with silence or dismissal. Character witnesses testified to Ruby's dedication as a mother and her struggles to provide for Chloe, painting a picture of a woman driven to an uncharacteristic act by overwhelming circumstances. As the trial progressed, the community remained divided. Some viewed Ruby's actions as a tragic but understandable response to systemic failures and personal betrayal, while others saw it as an inexcusable crime that shattered the peace of their town. Debates erupted in local establishments, with residents grappling with the complex interplay of morality, justice, and empathy. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Ruby was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, acknowledging the mitigating circumstances that led to the crime but also recognizing the severity of taking a life. She was sentenced to a term of imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a portion of her sentence. In the aftermath, Chloe was placed in the care of a relative, her future forever altered by the events that had transpired. The church, once a symbol of unity and faith, struggled to heal from the trauma of witnessing their pastor's violent death. Attendance dwindled as members grappled with their own feelings of betrayal and loss, and the building stood as a somber reminder of the hidden truths that had come to light. The town itself slowly began to move forward, though the scars of the incident remained. Conversations about responsibility, morality, and the consequences of one's actions became more prevalent, with many reflecting on the complexities of human behavior and the factors that drive individuals to commit unthinkable acts. While some found solace in their faith, others sought answers elsewhere, forever changed by the tragedy that had unfolded in their once quiet community.